Welcome to the first event of the new Swiss Re webinar series on climate change. My name is Thierry Corti and I'm the climate change lead at Swiss Re. In today's webinar, we'll look at the complex relationship between natural catastrophes and physical climate change. A recording of this webinar will be available for download after the event from our website. We will have today a presentation followed by a Q&A. To participate in the Q&A session and submit some questions, please scan the QR code you see on the screen or go to slido.com and enter the hashtag. To ensure that the question and answer session is as relevant as possible, we'd welcome questions only related to today's webinar. Feel free to start submitting questions already during the presentation. There's no need to wait until the end. The timing of today's event couldn't be better. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has just released its last report of the current cycle, the synthesis report, thus concluding the sixth assessment cycle of IPCC. In addition, Swiss Re has published the first Sigma report of this year, looking back to 2022 in terms of natural catastrophe and related losses. The Sigma publication shows that global insured losses from natural disasters grow by about 5 to 7% per year on average. Multiple drivers play an important role, including growing exposure, changing vulnerabilities, or climate change. And while climate change is only one driver among many, you can argue that climate change asks for most of the attention. And indeed, the exchange between climate change research and the insurance industry is critical to making the world more resilient. And it's therefore a pleasure for me to welcome an internationally acclaimed climate scientist, Professor Sonia Seneviratne. Welcome, Sonia. Sonia is professor for land climate dynamics at ETH Zurich. She has published more than 200 peer-reviewed and highly cited articles and received several awards for her research. She has been an author on several reports of the IPCC, most recently a lead author of the IPCC Special Report on the 1.5 degrees warming, and she was also a coordinating lead author of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Sonia.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Thierry, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to give this presentation. In this presentation, I will be speaking about changes in climate extremes, and I will show why every year matters. So the material is based on the report from IPCC. So the first pictures I'm showing here are just showing that the climate crisis is happening now and is affecting all regions of the world. The pictures you are seeing here are showing different events that recently happened, of which we know that they were made more probable due to human-induced climate change. Some of those events include the heat wave in Canada, 2021. There was a temperature of 49.5 degrees that was reached. There was also flooding associated with heavy precipitation in Germany, also in 2021. And then last year, there were also a range of extreme events. Some examples include the drought in Europe, and also flooding in Pakistan, where about 1/3 of the country was underwater. So what I will address in this presentation is what is the contribution of human emissions to change in these events, and also how can our decision affect future change in climate extremes. As Thierry mentioned, we have had a range of different reports in the sixth cycle of IPCC. I'm including here pictures of these different reports. There are 3 main reports and also special reports which were on dedicated topics like 1.5 degree global warming, change in the ocean, and change on land. And all of those reports have been summarized in the recent synthesis report. So I will start with what we know about global change in mean temperature. You see here a figure showing the evolution of global mean temperature. As you can see, the temperature we have reached is without precedent. We already reached 1.1 degree of global warming in the last decade compared to the second half of the 19th century. This temperature level is unprecedented in more than 100,000 years. So if you think of human history, agriculture started about 10,000 years ago, actually at temperature which were lower than today. The largest part of this warming is irreversible for several hundreds of human generations. So once CO2 is emitted in the air, it stays there for several hundreds to thousands of years. So this means what we have had so far is not going to go back. We have to live with the warming we have already reached. The best estimate of the contribution of human emissions to this warming is that all of the observed warming is due to human emissions. So we are responsible for the change we are seeing here. Now, the cause of those change I've mentioned is mostly CO2 emissions, and you can see this also from the change in CO2 concentration in the air. Here you see the evolution of CO2, and clearly the CO2 concentration have kept on increasing. And last May, we reached for the first time a number that was higher than 420 ppm. Now, the source of CO2 emission is also clear. It's mostly the use of fossil fuels. So it's basically burning of oil, gas, and coal, as you can see on this figure. And the emissions are also still increasing, as you can see here. Land use change is also contributing to CO2 emissions, mostly through deforestation. Now, about the relationship between CO2 emission and global warming, this is shown in this figure. You see that there is a direct linear relationship between the two. So the more CO2 we emit, the more global warming is happening. So it's almost a linear relationship. So every additional emission of CO2 leads to additional global warming. And in addition to this, given the Paris Agreement, which had as an aim to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and the fact that we have already gone past 1.1 degree, we see that we have a very small remaining CO2 budget for stabilization at about 1.5 degrees, as is shown here in light blue. Now we'll focus more on changes in climate extreme, which was the main topic addressed within the report. And this is actually a topic on which we have a lot of new evidence in the latest report from IPCC. So the evidence of observed change in extremes has strengthened, and we have evidence of changes in a range of types of events. Here in the report, we looked at changes in temperature extremes, heavy precipitation, floods, droughts, storms, and compound events. Some of the main messages is that human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. So no region is spared, every region is affected in one way or another. Another really important message is that for the first time in the last few years, we are starting to see events of which we can say they are truly exceptional, and we could not have had such events without our influence on the climate system. I mentioned before that every region is affected by some change in climate extremes, and this is also illustrated in those maps, which are showing in which region we are seeing an increase either in hot extremes, extreme rainfall, or drought. As you can see, every region is affected in some way. Almost all regions are affected by an increase in heat waves. Also, several regions are affected by an increase in rainfall, and some others by droughts. So really, again, the main message is that no region is spared, every region is affected in some way. About what will be the future, this really depends on our decisions. We are at the crossroad. So here on the left, you see a figure of the possible emission pathways that we could have in the future. And you see that there are some pathways in which we would still have a further increase in emissions. But obviously, we shouldn't follow these pathways if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So of those 5 pathways, only one would be consistent with a stabilization at 1.5 degrees. This is this light blue scenario. And so in this scenario, clearly we need to decrease emissions very quickly. And I will go back to this point. Now, what is at stake depending on what we are doing? Well, the more CO2 we are going to emit, the more global warming we are going to have. And the more global warming we have, the more change in extremes we would have. So we see that the frequency and intensity of climate extremes becomes larger with increasing global warming. This is the case for hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, agriculture and ecological droughts in some regions, and also the proportion of intense tropical cyclones. The important message is that even low levels of global warming have strong impacts. So we have much higher risk at 2 degrees of global warming compared to 1.5 degrees, including some irreversible impacts. Here I'm showing what we expect in terms of change of mean global temperature for those different scenarios. And what is showing in this figure is also what has implication for people. And basically, obviously, somebody who was born in 1960 will have seen now changes in the climate system. But the people who are going to be most affected are children who were recently born, because they are going to be really affected by how climate change is going to evolve in the coming decades. This means that the decisions we are taking now are really important for the younger generations. Here, I want to illustrate what are the implications of changing global warming for changing extremes. That's the example of changing hot extremes. So we are looking at an event that would have happened once every 10 years without an influence on the climate system. So hot temperatures, that was relatively rare. Such an event is already happening now 3 times every 10 years. So as mentioned before, climate change is already happening now. We are already seeing a strong change in the occurrence of those events. At 1.5 degrees, such an event would happen 4 times every 10 years. So that's what we expect more or less in 2030. That would be the best case scenario if we manage to stabilize global warming close to present day global warming. If we go to 2 degrees, we would have such extreme events 6 times every 10 years. This means that the majority of the summers would be extreme. And at 4 degrees, we would have such extreme events 9 times out of 10. So basically, almost all summers would be extreme. This clearly shows how the change in extremes are progressing as a function of global warming. Another important dimension, I think, especially for insurers, is the fact that we have multiple changes in extremes. So we shouldn't look at only single change, but also keep in mind that the same regions, for instance, might be affected one year by hot extremes and the other year by heavy precipitation. So we need to look at this compound change in extreme events. So some of the compound events we expect is also that different type of extreme may combine to additional risks. For instance, you can have concurrent heat waves and droughts, which lead to more fire weather conditions. You can also have compound flooding in coastal areas. This means that the flooding risk there is particularly strong because you have at the same time an increase in heavy precipitation and also an increase in sea level. Finally, you can also have an increase in concurrent extremes in many regions at the same time. This is also a strong concern, I think, for insurers. And it's, for instance, also a risk for food production, because you have more risk of having the different agricultural areas of the world being affected by climate extremes at the same time at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees. So this could affect global food production. Here, I'm just going to provide some examples of assessments of IPCC for 2 types of risk, but we have a lot more information in the reports. This figure here is showing how wildfire damage is increasing with increasing global wildfire damage risk is increasing with increasing global warming. So the risk when it's moderate is shown in yellow. So we see now at about 1 degree of global warming, we have moderate risk of fire. So we have had an increase in fire weather season. At about 1.5 degree, we would be shifting to high risk, to the red zone. And then purple means very high risk. This would happen at about 3 degrees. So we see clearly, for instance, there that going above 1.5 degrees would lead to much more risk than we have right now. I'm also showing the change in risk for food production on the right. And here we see an even stronger increase in the risk for low levels of global warming. So here also at about 1.1 degree of global warming, we are in a zone of about moderate risk. But we still already have infrequent price spikes that affect individual countries. At about 1.5 degree, we would be moving to high risk in red. So this means periodic food shocks across regions. And you see that we would be moving to very high risk at about 2 degrees of global warming. So again, at the level of global warming that is maybe not that high. Now we'll say a few words about the possible scenarios that we can follow if we want to stabilize global warming to 1.5 degrees. In this figure, you see the trajectory we should follow if we want to avoid having major overshoots, so at most 0.1 degree of overshoot. So this stabilization to 1.5 degree requires some change which are unprecedented in terms of scale, and also they need to happen very quickly. So you see here the trajectory of emission is a very sharp decrease of emission. The first really important point is that all the trajectories which are consistent with 1.5 degree of global warming have a halving of emissions by 2030. So this means very quick reduction in just a few years. The second point is that we need to reach net zero CO2 emission because as long as we're having emission, we are going to have still an increase of global warming. If we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degree, we need to reach net zero CO2 emissions at the latest in about 2040. This would be giving us 2/3 chance that we can limit global warming to 1.5 degree. As a target of 2050, which is often mentioned in policy making, is actually giving us only 50% chance that we can limit global warming to 1.5 degree. The final point is that we also need negative emission. Even actually after we have reached net zero CO2 emissions, and that's because we have basically emitted too much CO2. But we should be aware that the maximum potential there is of the order of about 10% of current day emissions. So this is not a panacea, it's not a magic solution, but we will need some solutions to also take up CO2 from the air. Now I wanted to show this figure, which is from the latest synthesis report, showing the similar figure for greenhouse gas emission. Again, you see the same trajectories for the scenarios for 1.5 degree. What we see here, obviously, is that we are not on track. So the current implemented policies means more or less a stabilization of emissions, but at the moment, no real decrease of emission. And actually, we're not even on track for stabilization at 2 degrees. So obviously, we need much more effort. Nonetheless, I would not want to be too negative, and that's why I would say, yes, we can make this change, and actually we should do it. And I will say a few words about what can be done there, and I'm also happy to discuss this afterwards in the question session. So the first point is that we have to stop using fossil fuels. I've shown at the beginning that about 90% of our emission of CO2 are due to fossil fuels. So wherever we have alternatives, we should move to those alternatives. This means no more use of coal, oil, and gas, moving to renewable energy, having clean electricity, and electrification of energy use. Yeah, that should be the main, solution for about 90% reduction of current CO2 emissions. On the other hand, we still need also to have solutions to take CO2 from the air, carbon dioxide removal. There are two alternatives. One is, for instance, with land-based solution, afforestation, but there are limits to this, and I will mention this also later. And there are also technological solutions with carbon capture and storage, but these at the moment are very small scale, and it's also limited in terms of where we could store the CO2. So there are several caveats, and again, as mentioned, at maximum with this type of solution, maybe we can take up about 10% of the current day CO2 emissions. So just a few words about actually one aspect that is of boring, I would say, which is that possibly this land-based sink might not work out if we have an increase in climate extremes. So as mentioned, many of the scenarios also have a taking up of CO2 through afforestation or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But the models that are used to develop those emission scenarios do generally not consider climate extremes. So this means that possibly in some location, if we plant trees, for instance, they might not survive, and I would say that's the main concern we would have for those scenarios. Here I'm just illustrating some examples of emission scenarios of where a forest is planted in these scenarios for 1.5 degree. And you see that in some regions, we have actually very extensive increase in forest cover. Nonetheless, as mentioned, this might not be fully realistic, so we should be aware that there may be some limits about what we can do in this area. So I come to the conclusions. It is definitely worth limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. This aim is stated in the 2015 Paris Agreement and it was also confirmed in the 2021 Glasgow Climate Plan. And the first essential step is that we need to have CO2 emissions until 2030. We could, if we manage to do this, avoid irreversible damages worldwide. There is no return from several consequences of climate change, such as heat wave deaths, species extinction, vanishing glaciers, or sea level rise. However, the window to act is closing very rapidly. So I mentioned again this deadline that we have by 2030. This would mean immediate action, including about 7 to 8% reduction of CO2 emissions every year from now on. But I want to finish with a not too negative message. I would say a world with low CO2 emissions would be nice to live in. We would have a safer climate, less climate uncertainty. We would have also more healthy conditions. We would have, for instance, less air pollution and also more geopolitical security. And I've seen actually in the last few months what are the consequences on the political side also of our dependence on fossil fuels. And finally, it would also not even be that expensive to achieve. I didn't have time to show the numbers from IPCC, but actually for a lot of the transition until 2030, so many of the solutions will be actually cheaper than using fossil fuels. And I'm happy to also answer questions on this point. So we finish with those words from IPCC. Every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. And every choice matters. Many thanks for the attention.